Excellent. Hello, everybody.
Hello.
All right. Feel free to go ahead.
Do we want to take a couple minutes for people to have a bathroom break or something, or should we go right on ahead?
That's a hard one.
I say a break for a minute would be great.
Right. Let's break for like 5 minutes.
Perfect.
Okay.
Hi, baby.
Dr. Werniak, your cat is very vocal.
Oh my gosh, it's that that's coming through my my AirPods. that is Gertrude, and she gets extremely opinionated about when she thinks it's dinner time.
I have a cat like that too.
Yeah.
Dr. Smith, you're actually on mute.
Sorry.
Don't worry.
I'm Erin Smith. I am an American Studies professor at UTD, and I'll be moderating the discussion. We have got two commentators, I guess, discussants, Dr. Larissa Werniak, who is the American Studies program head, and Kaz Naqvi, who is another professor in American Studies. So I guess I put a prompt in the chat for us about which lines or scenes were most powerful. And because we're taping and I don't think the chat is going to come through, I'm just going to read the first two. This is Aurora. Gosh, there's so many good ones. How about when Garabedian says, look, I'm not crazy. I'm not paranoid. I'm experienced. Check the docket. You'll see they control everything. And then mine was it takes a village to abuse a child, which for me was like summed the film up, right? There were so many different institutions participating in the cover up, right? That it was the sum total of all of this. And that seemed really powerful to me. Dr. Werniak or Dr. Naqvi, do you want to start with either the most powerful line or scene for you, or just, the takeaways that you'd like us to talk about?
Do you want to go ahead, Kaz?
Sure, I'd love to. Thanks for asking. The scene that really strikes me, it's kind of part of a larger theme that happens in the film, which is when Robbie is leaving the house of, I think Jim is the guy's name, his friend, and after they have this whole blow up in the living room, and he's been kicked out of the house after he wants him to identify all these names and be able to confirm the source, and he leaves there, and his friend Jim was basically like, hey, if this is something that we've all known, right, how come you've ignored it for so long, right? How can you claim you didn't know if apparently we all knew? And one of the things that I think is really powerful about that scene to me is that he's basically like, I don't know. He has like no real answer for that. And I think that that's one of the things that really struck me in the film, is this idea that, like, yes, it does take a village to abuse a child. Everybody knows seemingly, right? Including in some ways some of the key people who eventually uncover it. And yet somehow, like, they knew, but they never really accepted that they knew or believed it. And I think that's a really powerful part of the movie to me, where it's this idea of like, what are the things in retrospect we also are like, oh yeah, we know this bad thing is happening, but we've just chosen not to understand that it is. Even when it's like, later revealed that like, he's the guy in Metro who got the story and buried it. That really like leaves me asking a lot of questions. And so it's what really strikes me as the thing that like stays with me.
Yeah, like some of the moral and ethical ambiguities that the film brought out that way. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. And I think that, mine is kind of a logical segue here, because the line that I wrote down was a bunch of lawyers turning child abuse into a cottage industry. Obviously I have a legal background. I teach at the intersection of law and culture. One of the things that really struck me when different people were yelling at different people about who had responsibility and didn't have responsibility is that the lawyers were right. They were telling the truth. It is their ethical obligation not to disclose their names of clients to journalists. And, I found it really interesting in that scene because morally, obviously it feels as though Robbie is completely right that Jim Sullivan, who I believe is a composite character, I think that he is one of the only people in the film who's not a real person. I think he is made to represent like a number of attorneys. But he's right there ethically that he would be disbarred if he did that. And Robbie, the one who's really calling him to task, has also had a similar lapse, but actually doesn't have the same ethical obligation that he does. So I felt like untangling some of that was really, really interesting and difficult.
Can I jump in on that too? Because I
Yes.
also love that. One of the things that like I loved about the way these back and forth conversations, there's so few like one-off conversations in the film. It's like they come like the iterative process of journalism is part of this, but like they keep coming back to the same people to talk to them a second time, a third time, a fourth time. And like McLeish is an interesting character this way too, right? Because he's like this quintessential like slimy lawyer figure, and like he's like, look, I have this ethical obligation. I'm not allowed to talk about this. They're confidential. I'm supposed to. And then at the end, he's like, oh, but I also broke all of those earlier. I gave you all of the information. I'm not doing it again, right? And it's like one of the things that like really I find so striking about it is the way in which it's like, yeah, people have belief in these systems and they believe in these things, but they really use them also partly when they realize that like by stepping out of those things, I put a huge risk on myself. And you know what the payoff is? Nothing. I get no payoff. So why would I do this again? Or what was the point of me even doing it in the first place? And I think that's a really humanizing way to highlight that people do sometimes try to do the right thing. And if it doesn't get rewarded right away, it's so easy to become cynical then and to be like, all right, I'm going to collect my fees and do the thing. I tried, why would I spend my life the way like Garabedian does? Why would I spend my life slamming my head into the wall for no reason?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I teach a lot of trial films, right? And one of the things I talk to my students about is how are lawyers portrayed, right? And we have so many films where we have lawyer heroes, we have lawyer villains, we have lawyers, so many films now where we have lawyers who are insiders and are just kind of hopelessly entwined within the system. We still don't have a lot of ambivalently portrayed lawyers. And I feel like that's something that's so interesting in this film, even though it is a minor role. It's not a film about Billy Crudup, but when we're looking at that character, it's like you are actually asked to empathize with the slimy attorney, right? And if you think back to like where he would have been at that point in his career, he could not have been senior. He was doing a job that could not have been making him very much money. And apparently he did actually, really, really put it on the line in terms of like risking his profession, and it completely calls into question how you view that character, I think.
Well, and I'm also thinking about the original priest who came forward to testify, and then when it, got pushed under the rug, or it looked like he was going to get transferred to South America, he decided to be silent, right? Like once again, like Kaj said, I'm putting it out there. I'm putting myself at all this risk, and then he realizes my life is going to be horrible, and this is going to make no difference whatsoever. Yeah, I saw that coming back again and again. Yes. Go ahead.
Well, and one of the things with this institutional question aspect too, which is so interesting to me, is that it's like there's this notion of like, what are the institutions that people lose faith in? And like the obvious answer should be everyone should have lost, because look at how they failed so dramatically, right? But the way that I was sort of thinking about it when watching it this time around is that like actually the institution that failed was the paper, because failure is not just a measure of do they do the right thing, but it's also about like which institution has had power to do something and then failed to be able to utilize their power. And the church, even though it was failing all of these children, certainly didn't fail from a power perspective. They were able to win their battles, right? So that in some ways makes it make sense to me that like a lot of people who are in this story who could be trying to make a difference or know what's going on, they see that institution as not a failed institution, but an institution that's actually succeeding pretty dramatically. Whereas the paper is the failed institution because it has this ability to do stuff, but clearly it's going to get pushed around by the bigger institutions. So it actually has no power, and it's not going to do any of the things it's supposed to do. And so like that's really striking to me, how much like everybody throughout the film is just like, the Globe, well, we tried you guys earlier. Or, what are you going to be able to do about it? And so there's that interesting thing about institutional power.
Yeah, and I would think too, this is something that you see not uncommonly, similar patterns within prosecutors' offices, within, where all of a sudden you're getting all of this evidence about like the city attorneys were falsifying records or were, concealing exculpatory evidence or something. And I think that, there's something there about if you cross the institution and you risk, like you are the person that's risking weakening it, that seems like the most serious transgression, right? To go out on the line and to rock the boat that way with regard to the institution, because then you do risk that failure, right? That there is that like sort of existential failure of like, if what the institution is meant to do is to replicate power, it's this like really fundamental failure, and so that's the most dangerous thing, kind of.
I was also struck by the it's the new publisher or editor, I'm not sure what he is, like he's single, he's Jewish, he doesn't like baseball, right? Like it requires an outsider to break the case in some ways. And I guess I'm wondering, is that true, right? Like he says it, certainly he's the person who sort of instigates it, but sort of how do the insider, outsider, hero, villain lines, you know, get drawn?
If you don't mind, I'd love to jump in on that. Yeah, it's something I'm really passionate about. I feel like the film is telling that story that like, hey, people who are mostly outcasts are the ones who get this thing done, right? And they sort of make that point with Garabedian, with Barron, even with if you look at the Spotlight team, right? Like none of them are actually like practicing Catholics, right? They kind of make this point that everybody here is either lapsed or has switched denominations or other things like that. And I think that's really interesting because like, when I think about the story and when I ultimately think about like how the story gets put together, it's this really interesting mix of outsiders and insiders. I mean, without the insiderness of Robbie and the connections he has, I don't really know if they're able to get this thing done in the same way. And I kind of wonder about that, like to this extent to which like, do you need to have an outsider to break these kinds of stories when I think it's an oversimplification in this particular thing, perhaps because maybe it just so happens that the new editor is coming from out of town and is willing to kind of take some chances that other people aren't willing to do. And so I'm not sure. I'm a little bit torn in some ways about this question. And it's one of the things that I think that film seems to have a clear answer on, but then there are like pieces of it that seem to point in the opposite direction, which is that the insiders actually play a huge role in being able to overturn it because those access points are what actually fundamentally confirm the story or able to get it to happen.
And I'm thinking about the interview with the victim when Sasha says, I'm from Ohio, but my mom's from Southie, right? Or they say, you know, like he says, oh, that by that bad donut shop with the lousy coffee and the high prices. Like there's a way in which their Bostonness, people to confide in them or talk to them in ways that they wouldn't otherwise. And we get Jim to circle the names because, you know, he and Robbie are friends. Right? Like, so there's a way in which the insiderness was necessary to get the job done in ways that I don't think an outsider could. Okay, so we have this great question from in the chat. We touched on it a little in Women in Management class. How is it possible to settle on sexual discrimination cases and it all goes away and happens again to other people? So Larissa, I want you to talk to us a little bit about, you know, these sort of unofficial settlements that there are no records of and, you know, that kind of stuff. Like legally, how is this possible?
Yeah, you want to cut me off when I start rambling, inevitably. Okay. So what we want to think about at the outset here is obviously we've got a distinction between the civil justice system and the criminal system. Civil suits, we're suing each other, us people. Criminal is the state suing you and you go to jail, right? So those are two different spheres. And the vast majority of the cases that we're talking about here, for example, they are contemplations of civil suits. So basically tort claims, civil wrongs for damages. The idea that somebody has sexually harassed me, assaulted me, raped me, and I am suing them for the harm done, for damages. Okay, so we're in civil court. This is really, really important. So there are a whole bunch of factors here, and I think what's really important is how interwoven this web is, that is basically like replicating power and hierarchy. Part of that is the charitable immunity statute, which is really weird in Massachusetts. Most states went in the opposite direction in like the 70s and 80s, eliminating that, and Massachusetts doubled down. And I don't actually know how much power the court or the church had in that, but I wouldn't be surprised. It's basically saying that to sue a charitable institution like a hospital or the church, that you are limited to $20,000 in damages. So that is a factor, that is the max you can get in this kind of suit. So that's what you can sue the individual priest, but they have no money and they don't carry insurance, right? So that's why you sue the institution, because they're the deep pocket. And what happens in a settlement is that at any point between when you are contemplating litigation all the way up through 1 second before the jury delivers a verdict, the two parties can basically come to a private agreement. It is an agreement between the plaintiff or plaintiffs, defendant and defendants, and that is a completely private agreement. Technically, it is a contract. You are contracting with the other party. And as we know in this country, you can make a contract about almost anything you want to. You can't sue your kidneys. You can't murder for hire. That's almost about it. Otherwise, you can make a contract that where it's a private agreement to anything you want. And so if you are a defendant or a potential defendant, what you want to do is you want to find basically the plaintiff's squealing point. What's the lowest amount of money they will accept from you to promise not to sue you, to drop any and all claims, and also to promise confidentiality, that you are not going to disclose any of this. The Catholic Church worked this incredibly well in these cases. They got to people very, very early. So the suits had not even been filed yet in many instances. So there weren't any records to start with. Then in the cases that had been filed, those were the records that were sealed, which is completely at the judge's discretion. And the church was very able to convince them that this was all in the public interest. They even sealed the records of the hearings for putting the records under seal. So it was like two layers of things to like conceal the fact that these even existed. And so basically it is creating this very interwoven contractual system to make this go away entirely. Important fact here is that one of the few things that actually is illegal, you cannot contract with somebody to make them promise to not participate in a criminal investigation or to violate a subpoena. Most potential plaintiffs don't understand that or know that. They think that when they agree to confidentiality, that means total confidentiality, and so that they could not go to the police or to the EEOC. They are super worried that if they do, they will be saddled with a breach of contract lawsuit, which the courts will enforce. If you're just talking about something like this willy-nilly, then the other party to the agreement can go to court and have it enforced. People are scared of lawsuits. They don't want to get sued. They want this to go away. And so they tend to assume a broader sphere for this than is actually the case. Yeah. So technically, even if there is a viable criminal claim, regardless of any settlement, I believe in every state, you should be able to file a criminal complaint, and you certainly should be able to respond to a subpoena, to talk to investigators, to talk to the EEOC if it's like a workplace harassment claim or something like that. You cannot contract away criminal liability, but a lot of these things too, like when we think about the stuff that Harvey Weinstein did, for example, since those were women who were not underage for the most part, there was much more gray area about whether many of those actions actually would have given rise to criminal liability in the first place. So whether there's kind of this additional barrier, I think many of those women were like, I don't even know if this was a crime, let alone whether I'd be believed, let alone whether anything would happen to him. So like that is a really typical case as well, where there's a gray area about the criminal liability.
So I wanted to say something about how timely this film seems in its representations of the press. Like, for whatever its failings, this is a film that celebrates the power of the press to hold powerful institutions accountable. And so I see why that was important in 2015 when it came out, but I'm also thinking about this current moment that we're in right now. Like, I totally, like, this is a film for this moment as well, I think. And also, months deciding what story they're going to work on, and then they'll investigate a single story for reporters for a year. Like, does this happen anywhere anymore? Like, are there enough well-funded newspapers that you can get like big investigative stories like this anymore at all? So that's what it made me think of.
Yeah, I would love to jump in on that too. Right? It's a really good point that, like, one of the things that, having a lot of colleagues who finished graduate school in history and then kind of try to go into the journalism route afterwards, it's the pressure deadlines are so long. And it's interesting in this thing how often they're like, okay, 6 more weeks, or another 3 months, or we need till Christmas, and like the seasons are changing, all this kind of stuff. But you can see it in like the clips. And I was blown away by the idea that like you could have that much time to be able to do this, and just how much time it took. I thought one of the things the film did so well was to highlight just the amount of time they spent in archives, the amount of time they spent going through books, the amount of time that they spent at courtrooms, having to travel all over the place to do this kind of stuff. It's really like a pretty remarkable thing. And I also wondered how the role of technology's change affected this too, because like there are things in there that I loved seeing. I was like, oh, look at them diving into the microfilm, doing these kinds of things that, maybe you don't have to have as much delay on as you do today, but even still, like, they really highlighted one thing that struck me was like the number of times they got to the records office just too late, or they got to this thing, then come back tomorrow and talk to me. Like, come back tomorrow and talk to me was said at least like 3 or 4 times in the film, right? And I think it really helps show this element of just how long and in depth the process is. And when you think about, or when I think about the news today and how many kind of big stories there are, I struggle to see like who can fund 2 years worth of investigation or a year's worth of investigation. And I do wonder, like, I was thinking about this tension as well, and there was the level of depth that they wanted on how much verification of the story. And I do wonder if that is part of why we see more stories that are just like, okay, unnamed source says this, and we're just going to run with it because we got to run this out. We can't spend the rest of our lives trying to get, the crossing all the T's and dotting all the I's on the story. And so it is a really interesting thing, especially when they add that part about September 11th playing this huge role in delaying the story even further. And the idea that they wouldn't just kill it or they wouldn't just go with it at that point. It really is a pretty remarkable story they tell.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the funny things about the technology is that so much of the docket system is still stuck in 2001. If you want something obscure to be really, really angry about, come talk to me about dockets and document access. Federal courts are the worst. It's a system called PACER where they charge you for every search you run, not like pulling the documents, but actually the searches itself. So this is still really bad. And one of the things I was thinking about while watching this was like, I don't know if this story could have been written without computerized dockets, because they were actually able to go back and like reverse, almost like back jam the search system to be able to like go back in to find some of the stuff. But I looked up some of the original stories from the Spotlight team. I mean, I think there were 500 of them, total. So obviously I didn't read everything, but I was really impressed, thinking about, just as you're kind of saying, this type of journalism that we don't see that much anymore, and we might not have even realized when it went away, because it's so good, it's so precisely written, and it's so specific, and it's so local. And it's like the Metro reporter who's doing some of the smaller, like, they're getting all the law right. You know what I mean? And it's not just like fudged right, it's detailed right. Like, they probably talked to three law professors, at BU, BC, and Harvard to make sure that they got this like tiny detail right. And I think one of the things now is that we definitely have some good reporting, like ProPublica does really good stuff, some of the entities like that. But because of their funding models, they have to have such a broader scope, right? So it has to be kind of national. And they're talking so much more broadly about like, well, like this is kind of the big picture of like the thing and the stuff. And to look at how granular this is able to get in like a really, to my lawyer's eye, like a very beautifully precise, detailed evidence-rich way, it felt like something we don't have as much of anymore, like really profoundly.
And there's a question in the chat about social media and the role of that. And one thing that really struck me about it is that, like, throughout the concern they had about when to publish, they had the issue about, you know, when the victims would like them to publish, but then also they were like, okay, the Herald. And like the only place we hear anything about is the Herald. It's like they're in a two magazine or a two newspaper world. As long as the Herald doesn't have it, we're fine. We can hold this story for 25 years. And I do think that's one of the things that social media has really changed with the newspaper business and the publishing, is that, like, you can't just say, well, you know what? We have our rival, and if we have some inside info that they're not doing anything with this thing, then we're basically free to take our time with it, because other people can come out. There are all these, I mean, the irony of the journalism's decline in some ways, and the number of newspapers and the number of people working for newspapers, is that also there's like a massive proliferation of like not really journalists. And those people have fundamentally changed the game too, because they don't even necessarily listen to it and follow basic journalist ethics. And so they might just be, you know, attention is in some ways the goal right off the bat there. And so it is really interesting to think about, okay, if this is a 2020 story or 2015 story, like how different it is than being a 2000 and 2001 story, right? In terms of like the pressures in there to make sure that they don't just get scooped and have all of their stuff kind of just stolen from them, or, you know, as they were so concerned about it, little piece leaks out, makes the big headline, people get tired of it, there's not enough there, and then it goes away. And then when you publish your big actual story, everyone's like, oh, I already read that thing and this other thing that, you know, there's nothing there, right? And they sort of moved on with their lives.
Yeah.
I'm also wondering if social media has sort of changed how these stories surface, right? Because I'm thinking there was some elite prep school out east somewhere, and it was an alumni list, like a distribution list, you know, that a whole bunch of victims, you know, over 20 years sort of discovered each other and then, you know, went back to the school demanding some kind of accountability. And so I wonder if it's harder, like, to be the priest in the kitchen with the victims saying, well, we all know this is never going to happen again, and you're such good parishioners. And, you know, that it might be harder to pressure victims because there is this, you know, immediate kind of access to a larger community in certain kinds of ways.
I think that is possible. I also wonder, though, you know, the extent to which you as a victim might also feel the pressure of your community within, you know, on social media. It's something I was thinking about, Erin, when you were talking about the priest who found out he was going to get, you know, like literally jetted to Brazil or something. You know, because it's something that happens in litigation, right? Is that like, I mean, it's one of the reasons I never wanted to litigate at the trial level. Witnesses will just flip on you or shut down all the time. And the psychology of it, you know, so often it's this person like they want to tell the truth and they want to do what they feel like is the right thing, but they realize that like their whole world is gone, like that they have nothing, they have like no structure left after that, right? And because what you're doing seems so threatening, if you just don't, everybody will sort of like warmly embrace you back into the fold. And that feels so good after seeing the threat of like what your life could be like, you know? So I think I just kind of wonder if people would, you know, victims, people wanting to tell their stories would also kind of worry or speculate about how that would end up being amplified across social media in ways that they couldn't control.
Yeah.
And the risk of intimidation and attack is so much higher in this world that we're in now. I mean, the ability for people to just dox you, and then, you know, somebody who's just casually on the internet can know everything about you. They don't even have to be a subscriber to that newspaper. And then, you know, they can casually hurl insults at you without having to go get a piece of paper and write a letter and put an address. You know, like the level of vitriol and pushback you can find right away is high. You know, it's interesting because, like, you know, Dr. Smith, you brought up the idea that, like, well, there's the finding the support group and finding people who've been in a similar situation. One of the things that I found really fascinating in this film is that, like, they were all like, oh yeah, snap, yeah, well, you know, we've talked to those people before. We all know they exist, right? And and that to me was one of those, like, one of the many, like, yeah, you knew, so why were you not upset about this before? And they're just like, oh, you know those people who get abused by priests? They have an organization. We've talked to them before. They're unreliable people. Well, what do you mean they're unreliable people? Like, I was like so blown away by just the casualness of that conversation, you know? And it really, in my heart of me, wonders, like, these things are kind of lying in plain sight for everybody, but I don't know if the social media even changes that in the same way. But I don't have a great answer on that. It was just something that struck me.
But I'm also thinking about how easy it was to dismiss them, right? Like they were boys, mostly boys from poor homes who didn't have father figures, right? Like there's a way in which you can say, oh, those people, right? Like things happen to people like that versus people like us, right? Like there's a way in which, because of their class background, it was easier to think of them as not people like us, right? It was easier to dismiss them in spite of the fact that they had a support group, because the folks at the support group weren't folks who mattered on some kind of existential level. Yeah. So we have run over time. So I think we should like shut down the official program. And thank you so much, everyone, for coming. We'll hang around for a few more minutes to, you know, answer questions and talk. But thank you so much for coming.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'll send out the survey via email as well. Thank you, everybody. Have a great, great evening.
Is there anyone else here besides just IS people? Just
Nope.
asking. Well, it was really great, guys.